Before we descend into the cold, dark water tonight, a quick thank you to Discordant Sonata for sending in this topic. It arrived in the inbox with a single line. Something wrong on the ocean floor. That was enough. And if you're listening to Sleep Theories on Spotify right now, and you have not yet left a review, please do it. It takes 10 seconds, it costs nothing, and it helps this channel reach people who need exactly this kind of story to fall asleep. Now, take a breath. Close your eyes if you like. We are going somewhere few humans have ever seen. The Baltic Sea does not look like a place that holds secrets. From above, it is grey-green and unremarkable. A shallow inland sea pinched between Scandinavia and the European continent, fringed by Finland to the north, Germany to the south, Poland to the east, and Sweden to the west. Ships cross it daily. Ferries loaded with passengers and freight cut through its chop every hour of every day. The fishing vessels that have worked these waters for generations know its moods, its tides, its quiet violence during winter storms. Sailors and merchants and naval officers have been crossing this sea for more than 2,000 years. It has always been busy. It has always been watched. And yet the Baltic holds things in its depth that no one has fully catalogued, no one has fully understood, and, in at least one remarkable case, no one has fully explained. This is the story of that case. This is the story of a circular shape resting on the seafloor, discovered by accident in the summer of 2011. It is the story of divers descending into near blackness to investigate something that should not exist. It is the story of equipment that stopped working for no clear reason, of research funding that evaporated quietly, of interest that bloomed spectacularly, and then died back almost as if something had pressed it down. It is the story of one investigative journalist who began pulling on a thread that the scientific world seemed to have quietly tucked away. And it is the story of a question that has never been fully answered. What is the object beneath the Baltic Sea, and why did the world stop looking? To understand how this story begins, you need to understand what the Baltic Sea looks like from underneath. The seafloor of the Baltic is not like the dramatic abyssal plains of the Pacific, or the mountain ranges that run along the floor of the Atlantic. It is, by comparison, modest, an undulating landscape of silt and sediment, glacially scoured rock, ancient riverbeds now buried under decades of accumulated debris, and the remains of everything that has ever sunk in these waters. Warships from the First World War lie down there, their hulls slowly dissolving. Merchant vessels from the Second World War rest on their sides in the cold mud. Aircraft that were shot down during the conflicts of the 20th century are scattered across the seabed in various states of decay. Older wrecks, wooden trading ships from the medieval period, Viking-era vessels, are preserved by the Baltic's low salinity, which prevents the wood-boring organisms that would destroy them in saltier oceans. The Baltic is, in a very real sense, the most densely archived seafloor in the world. History does not dissolve here. It accumulates. It was this accumulation that drew Peter Lindbergh to the Baltic Sea in the summer of 2011. Lindbergh was a Swedish ocean explorer and commercial diver who had spent years developing a specialty in deep-sea discovery. He was not a pure academic researcher. He was the kind of man who worked in the space between science and enterprise, making his living locating valuable cargo from historic shipwrecks and selling rights to recovery operations. His company, the OceanX team, was a small and tight-knit operation, and in June of 2011 they set out on an expedition into the northern Baltic Sea with a specific mission in mind: locate historic shipwrecks, assess their commercial potential, and catalogue what they found. It was the kind of work the team had done many times before. Methodical, practical, driven by sonar. Side-scan sonar is the tool of choice for this kind of survey work. It works by emitting pulses of sound from a towfish, a torpedo-shaped instrument dragged behind the vessel, and measuring how those sound pulses bounce back from the seafloor. The returns are assembled into a continuous image, a ghostly grey and white portrait of the bottom in cross-section. Rock formations appear as dark shadows. Raised objects cast long acoustic shadows across the sonar image. Shipwrecks look unmistakably like shipwrecks. Angular shapes, scattered debris, the distinctive outlines of hull and keel. An experienced sonar operator can read these images the way a radiologist reads an X-ray, with knowledge of what things ought to look like and an immediate recognition when something is wrong. On a June afternoon in 2011, something was very wrong. The towfish was moving at a depth of roughly 300 feet below the surface when the sonar return shifted. The image on the monitor changed. The operator stared at it, then called Lindbergh over. Lindbergh looked at the screen, and then he looked again. What the sonar was showing was a massive circular structure resting on the seafloor. It was approximately 60 metres in diameter, roughly the length of a Boeing 737 from nose to tail. It sat raised above the surrounding seabed, which immediately ruled out the possibility that it was simply a depression or a shallow formation flush with the bottom. It had edges. It had geometry. And extending from its outer perimeter were what appeared to be long, linear formations running across the seafloor, straight lines that traced out from the disk in a way that no natural geological feature should produce. The overall shape in the sonar image was so defined, so symmetrical, and so unlike everything else in the surrounding landscape that the OceanX team simply sat with it for a moment, trying to decide what they were looking at. The answer was, they did not know. They saved the sonar file. They marked the coordinates, and when they returned to port they mentioned what they had found, cautiously, without drama. But within days the sonar image had leaked onto the internet, and within weeks the world had given it a name: the Baltic Sea Anomaly. The reaction was immediate and enormous. In the particular ecology of online discourse that existed in 2011, a sonar image of a mysterious circular object on the ocean floor was the kind of thing that could travel at extraordinary speed across forums, blogs, news aggregators, and social media. The image was striking, not because it showed something dramatic, but because it showed something wrong. A perfect circle sitting on the floor of a well-travelled sea where no perfect circle had any right to be. People began attributing it immediately. UFO investigators suggested it was an extraterrestrial craft. Conspiracy theorists speculated it was a secret military installation. Pseudoscientific researchers connected it to theories about Atlantis and sunken civilizations. The more measured commentators simply said, "This is unusual, and someone should investigate." The OceanX team agreed, and so they planned to go back. It was not until the summer of 2012, a full year after the original discovery, that the team mounted a proper return expedition to the Anomaly site. The delay was partly logistical and partly financial. Mounting a deep-sea investigation in the Baltic is not cheap. Equipment must be hired. Diving support vessels must be secured. Specialist divers with the capacity to work at 300 feet in cold water with limited visibility must be assembled. The preparation took months. And when the team finally returned to the coordinates they had marked the previous summer, they descended into conditions that made the investigation far harder than they had hoped. The Baltic Sea at 300 feet is not like the clear blue water of tropical diving. It is cold, the kind of cold that eats through wetsuit material and makes fingers clumsy and thinking slow. The visibility at that depth in the Baltic can be measured in feet rather than meters, particularly where silt and sediment have been disturbed. The pressure at that depth is significant. Divers working there move carefully, conserve their air, and cannot stay long. The margin for error is narrow, and the margin for detailed investigation of a complex underwater structure is narrower still. Despite all of this, the divers reached the anomaly, and what they reported when they surfaced was not nothing. The structure, they said, had smooth surfaces in certain areas, not the rough, irregular texture you would expect from a natural rock formation. It appeared to have stepped formations like stair-like shapes cut into its sides. Its edges were curved and consistent in a way that seemed deliberate. Some sections were partially buried in the silt that had accumulated over how many years? That was one of the questions no one could answer. One diver described a surface that felt almost metallic under his gloved hand. though he could not be certain given the limited sensation available through dive gloves at that pressure and temperature. Another reported a perfectly straight sill, a horizontal ledge, running along one section of the structure's base that appeared machined rather than formed. Video footage from the dive was limited and difficult to pass. The visibility was too poor for the cameras to produce clean, interpretable images. What came back was murky, granular, shadowed footage that showed shapes but not certainty. The divers had been there, they had touched it, but the evidence they brought back was frustratingly incomplete. And then came the reports about the equipment. The equipment failures were, in many ways, the detail that transformed the Baltic Sea anomaly from an interesting sonar curiosity into something that people could not stop talking about. The Ocean X team reported that during the dive operations above the Anomaly site, several of their electronic instruments malfunctioned. Cameras stopped recording. Satellite phones lost signal. Navigation equipment behaved erratically. The failures were not random. They appeared to be localized. When equipment was moved away from the position directly above the structure, it began working again. When it was brought back over the site, the failures resumed. The team noted this pattern repeatedly across multiple operations during the expedition. It was consistent enough that they began to treat it as a feature of the site rather than a coincidence. Now, before we proceed, we should say something important. Electronic equipment malfunctions underwater for many reasons. Pressure seals fail, saltwater infiltrates poorly maintained housings, cold temperatures affect battery performance and electronic function in ways that can produce intermittent failures that seem systematic but are in fact mechanical. A dive operation in the Baltic is a genuinely difficult technical environment, and the list of mundane explanations for equipment failure is long. Any responsible analysis of the Ocean X team's reports has to begin with the understanding that these failures may have had perfectly ordinary causes. The Ocean X team knew this too. They were professionals. They were not naive about the mechanics of underwater technology, and yet they maintained, consistently and over time, that the pattern of failures at the Anomaly site was not something they could explain through normal equipment degradation. The failures were too localized, too reliable, too specifically tied to the position above the object on the seafloor. Some researchers, watching from a distance, began to speculate about the nature of whatever electromagnetic field might produce such effects. Strong magnetic anomalies exist naturally in certain geological formations. Basaltic rock, for instance, can carry significant magnetic charge that affects compass readings, and in extreme cases, electronic equipment. But the Baltic seafloor in this region is not known for strong magnetic geology. There is no documented basaltic formation near the Anomaly site that would account for the reported interference. The natural explanations existed in theory, but did not map cleanly onto the observed facts. Others went further. If something on the seafloor were actively generating an electromagnetic field, not passively magnetized but actively producing energy of some kind, it would require a power source, and a power source buried under 300 feet of Baltic seawater for an unknown number of years, still apparently functioning, would be remarkable by almost any definition of that word. No one was ready to claim that yet. But the possibility was in the room, and it stayed there. The scientific community's response to the Baltic Sea anomaly was not contemptuous, it was measured. That distinction matters. Marine geologists who reviewed the sonar data noted correctly that the Baltic seabed contains many unusual formations produced by glacial activity over tens of thousands of years. The last ice age peaked approximately 20,000 years ago, and at that time the Scandinavian ice sheet covered an enormous area that included the land now submerged beneath the Baltic. As the glaciers advanced and retreated, they shaped the underlying rock in ways that can, under certain sonar imaging conditions, produce shapes that appear almost geometrical. Glacial erratics, large boulders carried by ice and deposited far from their origin, are common throughout the region. Moraines, the ridges of rock and sediment pushed forward by glacier movement, can form curved, nearly circular patterns when a glacier retreats in a particular way around a fixed point. The scientist who argued for a glacial explanation did not say that the Baltic Sea anomaly was unremarkable. They said that it was a remarkable natural formation, a geological accident that happened to produce a shape resembling something artificial. This is not an unprecedented situation in the history of geology. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas, for instance, was once widely claimed to be an ancient underwater causeway, before marine geologists demonstrated that its regular rectangular limestone blocks were the product of natural fracturing processes. The Oniguni Monument off the coast of Japan continues to generate debate about whether it is a natural or constructed formation. Geology occasionally does things that look like engineering. The scientists arguing for a natural origin of the Baltic anomaly were drawing on a genuine tradition of misidentified natural formations. But critics of the glacial explanation had a counter-argument. They noted that the anomaly's reported dimensions, 60 metres in diameter with a consistent circular profile, were unusually precise for a glacial formation. They noted that the linear extensions running from the disk perimeter did not match any known pattern of glacial deposition. They noted that the stepped formations described by the divers, if accurate, implied a level of structural regularity not typically produced by ice movement. And they noted that no other formation of similar dimensions and shape had been identified anywhere else in the Baltic, despite extensive sonar surveying of the region. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but the specificity of this anomaly, its isolation, its dimensions, its shape, gave even some sceptical researchers pause. The debate settled into a stalemate that neither side could break without better data. And better data required more diving. More diving required more funding. And funding, it turned out, was about to become a problem. This is where the story shifts from mystery to something more unsettling. In the months following the 2012 expedition, the Ocean X team attempted to organise follow-up investigations. They had made contact with academic institutions. They had spoken with research bodies. They had begun applying for funding through channels that support marine scientific investigation. The interest, initially, was genuine. Several universities expressed willingness to collaborate. A handful of oceanographic research groups discussed sending their own equipment to the site. The Baltic Sea anomaly had caught the attention of people who were capable of conducting the kind of rigorous, well-instrumented investigation that would produce definitive answers. And then, gradually, that interest cooled. Not all at once, not with any dramatic announcement, simply calls that were returned less promptly, proposals that were reviewed and then not advanced, funding applications that were submitted and came back denied without detailed explanation, collaborative discussions that reached an early stage and then stalled. The pattern was subtle enough that it could be attributed to any number of mundane factors: budget cycles, competing research priorities, the inherent conservatism of academic institutions when it comes to subjects that carry any association with conspiracy theory. None of these explanations is implausible. All of them together formed a wall that the Ocean X team was unable to climb over. It was this pattern that drew the attention of Daniel Ekström. Ekström was a Swedish investigative journalist whose prior work had focused on the opacity of institutional decision-making, the ways in which organisations, both public and private, manage information in ways that serve their own interest rather than the public's. He was not a sensationalist. He was the kind of journalist who builds his cases slowly, from documents rather than speculation, and who is deeply suspicious of the dramatic explanation when a boring one is available. He came to the Baltic Sea anomaly sceptically. He expected to find a simple explanation for the research freeze, some procedural reality about how marine science funding works, some boring truth about academic priority setting. He expected to write a short piece debunking the conspiracy theories and explaining the actual mundane reasons why the anomaly had not received proper scientific attention. What he found instead gave him pause. The Baltic Sea during the Second World War was not a peaceful backwater. It was a contested zone of extraordinary strategic importance, a body of water through which Germany moved troops and supplies to its Eastern Front operations, through which Sweden exported iron ore to German industry under conditions of enforced neutrality, and through which the Soviet Baltic Fleet operated under constant pressure from German air and naval forces. The waters were heavily mined. They were patrolled. They were the site of significant naval engagements, including one of the largest maritime disasters in history. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff in January of 1945, which killed an estimated 9,000 people and remains largely unknown outside the region. The Baltic was also the site of significant experimental military activity. Germany's naval research programs during the Second World War were ambitious and in some cases deeply unusual. The Kriegsmarine was interested in acoustic detection technologies, electromagnetic weapons research, and various projects that occupied the frontier between practical military application and what might charitably be called speculative engineering. Some of this research was conducted at facilities along the Baltic coast. Some of it involved experimental hardware that was, in the chaos of the war's end, either destroyed, sunk, or simply lost. The documentation for these programs is incomplete, partly because records were deliberately destroyed as German forces retreated, and partly because Soviet occupation of portions of the Baltic coast after the war produced its own layer of institutional amnesia. Post-war, the Baltic remained a front line of Cold War tension. Soviet and NATO forces operated in close proximity for decades. Submarine activity in the region was intense and largely classified. In the 1980s, Swedish naval forces repeatedly detected suspected Soviet submarine intrusions into Swedish territorial waters, incidents that generated significant diplomatic tension and that were subsequently confirmed as real, though the details of what the submarines were doing remained murky. The Baltic during the Cold War was a place where unusual things happened quietly, and where the institutions responsible for managing national security had strong reasons to keep certain information from public view. Ekstrom, reviewing naval records and archived research proposals, found something he had not expected. In the documentation surrounding several of the declined proposals to investigate the Anomaly site, there were references, vague, never elaborated upon, to existing sensitivity around that particular section of the Baltic Sea floor. Not in every document, not explicitly, but consistently enough across multiple independent sources that Ekstrom began to take them seriously. The references did not say what the sensitivity was. They did not identify what authority had imposed it, or when. They simply noted, in the way that bureaucratic language always notes things it does not wish to explain directly, that the area required special consideration before any survey activity was authorised. Ekstrom submitted freedom of information requests to 3 separate government bodies. 2 came back with redacted documents. 1 came back with nothing at all, accompanied by a letter, noting that no relevant documents existed, a response Ekstrom found curious given that he had documentary evidence of correspondence referencing those very documents. He could not prove suppression. He could demonstrate a pattern. And in investigative journalism, those are sometimes the same thing. The theories about what the Baltic Sea anomaly might be have proliferated over the years into a taxonomy of speculation that ranges from the plausible to the extraordinary. At the most grounded end of the spectrum is the theory that the anomaly is a piece of military technology, not extraterrestrial, not ancient, but constructed by human hands in the 20th century and then lost, sunk, or deliberately placed on the seafloor. This could be a piece of experimental sonar equipment, perhaps, a large acoustic, reflector or transducer deployed during the Cold War as part of one of the NATO or Soviet underwater detection networks that existed throughout the Baltic. It could be a prototype weapon system, or a component of a weapons test. It could be the remnant of a wartime experimental project that never made it into the public record because the program itself was classified and the record-keeping incomplete. This theory has the advantage of requiring no extraordinary assumptions. Human beings were conducting unusual things on the Baltic Sea floor during the 20th century. We know this. The gaps in the documentary record are real and documented. A piece of classified military hardware resting on the seafloor, unacknowledged by the relevant authorities, is not a remarkable claim. It is the kind of thing that happens in the history of military programs with some regularity. The next tier of theory involves the idea of prehistoric or ancient civilization construction, the suggestion, that the anomaly is the remnant of a structure built by human beings long before recorded history began in the Baltic region. This is not as wild an idea as it might initially appear. The Baltic Sea floor was dry land at the peak of the last ice age. As the glaciers retreated and sea levels rose, the land that is now submerged would have been habitable, and was, in fact, inhabited. Archaeological evidence of human settlement in areas now beneath the Baltic has been recovered in several locations. A structure built by these prehistoric communities and submerged as sea levels rose over thousands of years would have been sitting on the seafloor since roughly 8,000 years before the present. The glacial processes that scientists invoke to explain the anomaly as a natural formation would have occurred after and around such a structure, potentially reshaping its visible contours. This theory does not require supernatural intervention. It requires only that the people who lived in near pre-Baltic Scandinavia were capable of building large circular structures, which is not an implausible claim given what we know about Neolithic construction traditions. At the far end of the spectrum sits the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the claim that the anomaly is a spacecraft or technological artifact of non-human origin. This theory has significant barriers to credibility, not least because it requires an enormous inferential leap from a blurry sonar image to a conclusion that overturns the entire known history of intelligent life in the universe. But it is worth noting why the theory has persisted with such tenacity. The reported equipment malfunctions are central to it. A natural rock formation does not generate electromagnetic interference. A piece of 20th century military hardware might, but its power source would presumably have been depleted by now, decades later. An object that is still actively generating an electromagnetic field after an unknown period on the seafloor is, by definition, still powered, and the question of what is powering it remains open. None of these theories has been confirmed. None of them has been definitively ruled out. That is the particular frustration of the Baltic Sea anomaly as a mystery. The data that exists is insufficient to close the question in either direction. What would be needed is a properly equipped scientific expedition, sonar mapping at high resolution, sediment coring around the structure's perimeter, rock sampling, magnetometric survey, and sustained video documentation under better visibility conditions than the OceanX team was able to achieve. This is not technologically difficult. It is organisationally and financially achievable, and it has not happened. There is another dimension to this story that often gets lost in the noise of the speculation, and it is the dimension that matters most if you are trying to understand not just the anomaly itself, but the world that surrounds it. Consider what we know about deep-sea exploration. Despite the fact that the ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, humanity has explored only a fraction of the seafloor in any meaningful detail. The deep ocean is harder to access than the surface of the moon. The technology required to map it comprehensively exists, but is expensive to operate and in limited supply. The institutions that control access to that technology, national navies, oceanographic research bodies, commercial deep-sea operators, have their own priorities, their own interests, and their own reasons to direct their resources towards certain questions and away from others. The result is a body of water covering most of our planet that remains, in the vast majority of its extent, unmapped and uninvestigated at the resolution required to identify structures of the kind the OceanX team stumbled across in the northern Baltic. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply the reality of resource allocation in a world where ocean exploration is chronically underfunded relative to its scientific importance. But it means that when something unusual appears on a sonar image in a well-travelled sea, not in the deep Pacific, not in the remote Southern Ocean, but in the Baltic, a sea that has been intensively used by human civilization for more than 2,000 years, we should perhaps take that appearance seriously. If this formation exists in the Baltic, a sea we consider well known, we should ask what exists in the seas we genuinely do not know. Ekstrom, after years of investigation, never arrived at a definitive conclusion. His published writing on the anomaly is characteristically careful. He presents the evidence he found, notes the gaps, identifies the patterns, and declines to speculate beyond what the documentation supports. He believes that something anomalous exists on the seafloor at the reported coordinates. He believes that the absence of sustained, scientific investigation into that anomaly requires explanation. He does not know what that explanation is. That is, in its own way, a remarkable thing for an investigative journalist to admit. He went looking for a story he could close, and he came back with one he could only open wider. The OceanX team conducted a third visit to the Anomaly site in the years following their initial expeditions. The conditions, again, were difficult. The visibility again was poor. The footage, again, was insufficient to resolve the question definitively. Members of the team have spoken about the site in the years since with a combination of genuine conviction and genuine frustration. Conviction that what they found is real and significant. Frustration that they have been unable to document it in a way that compels institutional engagement. Peter Lindbergh, in interviews over the years, has been consistent. He does not claim to know what the structure is. He does not endorse the extraterrestrial theories. He describes himself as a practical, results-oriented professional who found something genuinely unusual and has been trying ever since to get someone to take it seriously enough to investigate properly. He is, in the interviews, the opposite of a sensationalist. He is tired and a little frustrated and very clear about what he knows versus what he suspects. The world, meanwhile, has moved on to other mysteries. The internet that made the Baltic Sea anomaly famous in 2011 generates new mysteries at a rate that makes sustained attention difficult. New sonar images, new archaeological discoveries, new unexplained phenomena arrive constantly, and the attention economy allocates its resources accordingly. The anomaly has not disappeared. It still circulates, still generates discussion in communities devoted to unexplained phenomena, but it no longer commands the front page. The researchers who once expressed interest have mostly turned their attention elsewhere. The funding that once seemed possible has materialized into nothing, and somewhere beneath 300 feet of cold Baltic water, at coordinates that were recorded a little over a decade ago, whatever is there remains, undisturbed, unexplained, in the dark. Before we reach that inventory of known and unknown, it is worth pausing to consider the people most closely involved, not as characters in a thriller, but as human beings navigating a peculiar situation that the normal frameworks of professional life had not prepared them for. Peter Lindbergh did not set out to become famous for finding an anomaly. He set out to find wrecks. He is a commercial operator by trade and instinct, and the Baltic Sea anomaly cost him, in a very real sense, more than it gave him. The expeditions to investigate the structure required significant funding that produced no commercial return. The media attention, while initially valuable for the profile of the OceanX team, eventually became a burden, attaching his name permanently to a subject that serious institutions associated with conspiracy theory, which made certain kinds of professional collaboration more difficult. He has spoken in interviews about the toll that the ambiguity takes. Not knowing what you found is a particular kind of frustration that does not resolve with time, it simply accumulates. The divers who descended to the site in 2012 have been more reticent. Most of them have declined to speak publicly in detail about what they found, beyond the reports that were included in the OceanX team's own documentation. One, whose name has appeared in accounts of the expedition, but who has not sought public attention, gave a single interview to a Swedish documentary filmmaker in 2015, in which he described the experience of reaching the structure and placing his hand on it. He said that the feeling was not fear. It was, he said, the feeling of touching something that did not fit any category his experience had given him. He had dived on shipwrecks. He had dived on rock formations. He had spent hundreds of hours at depth in the Baltic and other seas, and he said that the surface of the anomaly, whether rock or something else, felt to him unlike anything he had encountered in those hours. He could not explain why. He did not try to explain why. He simply noted it as a fact of his experience and left the interpretation to others. That diver's restraint is, in its own way, instructive. The most compelling testimonies about the Baltic Sea anomaly are not the wild ones. They are the careful ones. The accounts from people who are clearly trying to report accurately rather than dramatically, who acknowledge the limits of their own knowledge, who resist the pressure to fill the gaps in their understanding with speculation. The internet is full of dramatic claims about the anomaly. The people who actually went there and touched it are almost uniformly more cautious than the people who have only seen the sonar image. That gap between the restraint of direct experience and the confidence of distant interpretation is one of the defining features of how the Baltic Sea anomaly has been discussed. It is also one of the reasons that the mystery has persisted. If the OceanX team had come back from their dives making extraordinary claims, they would have been easier to dismiss. Instead, they came back saying, "We don't know what it is, we know it's unusual, and we think someone should investigate properly." That message is harder to argue with. It does not give the skeptic a target. It simply says, there is something here, and it deserves attention. Let us return for a moment to the geology, not to resolve the question, but to understand it more precisely, because the geological debate around the Baltic Sea anomaly is more nuanced than it is usually presented in popular coverage of the story. The Baltic region's geological history is extraordinary. 14,000 years ago, as the most recent glaciation began to retreat, the area now occupied by the Baltic Sea was dry land, part of a vast periglacial plain that extended across northern Europe. As temperatures rose and the ice sheet contracted northward, meltwater began to fill the basins that the glaciers had carved into the bedrock. This process was not steady or gradual. It happened in pulses, with periods of rapid flooding alternating with periods of relative stability. The Baltic Sea has, at various points in the last 15,000 years, been a freshwater lake, a saltwater arm of the ocean, and a partially enclosed sea with fluctuating salinity, each phase producing different conditions on the seafloor and different effects on the sediment and rock that now lies beneath the water. The glaciers themselves left extraordinary marks on the landscape above water and below. Moving ice exerts enormous pressure on the rock beneath it, pressure sufficient to fracture, grind, polish, and reshape stone at scales ranging from microscopic scratch marks to kilometre-long troughs. Glacial erratics, boulders plucked from their geological context by advancing ice, and deposited far from their origin when the ice retreated, are found throughout the Baltic region. Some of them enormous, some of them with shapes that appear almost deliberate. The processes of glacial deposition can produce formations with unexpected regularity. Concentric ridges called drumlins, elongated hills called drumlins, horseshoe-shaped ridges called moraines, and circular depressions called kettles, formed when blocks of dead ice were buried in sediment and then melted, leaving bowl-shaped hollows. Marine geologists pointing to a glacial origin for the Baltic Sea anomaly are drawing on this rich and well-documented tradition of glacially produced unusual shapes. Their argument is not that the anomaly looks like a typical glacial formation. It clearly does not. Their argument is that glacial processes are capable of producing atypical formations, and that an atypical glacial formation is far more probable than any alternative explanation that involves human construction or non-natural origin. In the formal language of Bayesian reasoning, the prior probability of an unusual geological feature is vastly higher than the prior probability of a technological artifact of unknown origin, and that prior probability does a lot of work in the assessment of ambiguous evidence. The counter-argument from anomaly supporters is also formally coherent, that the sonar image of the Baltic Sea structure differs not just in degree but in kind from known glacial formations, that the circular regularity, the raised profile, the peripheral linear extensions and the reported surface characteristics are, taken together, a cluster of features that no documented glacial process produces in combination, and that the appropriate response to a cluster of features with no known natural explanation is not to assert a natural explanation anyway, but to investigate until the question is resolved. This is, when stripped of the conspiracy theory overlay that the internet has draped over the story, actually a reasonable scientific disagreement. The problem is that the conspiracy theory overlay makes it difficult to have the reasonable scientific disagreement in a professional context without becoming associated with the wilder claims. Scientists are human beings operating in social institutions. No researcher wants to publish a paper about the Baltic Sea anomaly, only to find it cited in articles about alien spacecraft. The reputational risk of serious engagement with the topic is real, and it has almost certainly contributed to the scarcity of that engagement. This is not a conspiracy. It is the sociology of science operating as it usually does, conservatively, defensively with one eye, on professional standing. The result is a topic that deserves serious investigation, and has not received it, for reasons that are entirely comprehensible and entirely insufficient. There is a broader context for the Baltic Sea anomaly story that is rarely discussed but that shapes it in important ways, and that is the history of underwater archaeology in the Baltic more generally. The Baltic Sea is, as noted earlier, one of the world's great repositories of underwater archaeological material. Its low salinity and cold temperatures have preserved wooden shipwrecks in extraordinary condition, ships that would have dissolved into splinters within decades in the warmer, saltier waters of the Mediterranean or the Atlantic can be found in the Baltic still largely intact after 3 or 4 or even 500 years on the seafloor. The wreck of the Vasa, the Swedish warship that sank in Stockholm harbour in 1628 and was raised in 1961, is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. The Baltic holds wrecks from virtually every period of Baltic maritime history: Viking ships, Hanseatic merchant vessels, warships from the conflicts of the 17th and 18th centuries, naval vessels from the 2 world wars. It is an archive of human maritime history of almost unparalleled richness. Systematic underwater archaeological work in the Baltic has been ongoing since the mid-20th century, but it has never been comprehensive. The sea is large, the budget available for underwater archaeology is always limited, and the combination of military sensitivity and commercial rivalry over wreck sites has complicated the development of a coherent research program. What this means in practice is that there are significant portions of the Baltic seafloor that have never been systematically surveyed, not because the technology to survey them does not exist, but because no one has funded the survey. The Anomaly site falls within one of these unsurveyed zones. The OceanX team's Sonar pass, commercially motivated rather than scientifically directed, was the first systematic look at that section of seafloor in recorded history. What else is down there, in the sections of Baltic seafloor that have also never been surveyed? The honest answer is that we do not know. The Baltic's capacity to preserve material means that whatever sank or was placed on that seafloor remains there, in some form, waiting for someone to find it. The anomaly may be the most dramatic thing yet to emerge from the unsurveyed zone, or it may be one of many. The sonar image that the OceanX team recorded in 2011 is a single data point in a dataset that has not yet been collected. The full scope of what lies beneath the Baltic remains, as it has always been, a question the sea has not yet been asked in a language it can fully answer. Here is what we know, with confidence. In June of 2011, the OceanX team recorded a sonar image of a large circular formation on the Baltic seafloor. The formation is approximately 60 metres in diameter. It sits raised above the surrounding seabed. It has unusual linear extensions extending from its perimeter. Its shape is not consistent with the most common types of natural glacial formation, though natural explanations have been proposed. Divers who descended to the site in 2012 reported unusual surface characteristics and equipment malfunctions that they could not explain through normal technical failure. Subsequent investigation into the anomaly, despite significant initial public and scientific interest, did not result in a sustained, properly equipped scientific survey. Investigative research into why that survey never occurred found suggestive but not conclusive evidence of institutional reluctance that may or may not be connected to historical military sensitivity about the area. Here is what we do not know. We do not know what the structure is. We do not know when it was formed or deposited or constructed. That word choice itself remains unresolved. We do not know whether it is natural or artificial, ancient or modern, inert or active. We do not know whether the equipment malfunctions were genuine anomalies or mundane equipment failures. We do not know whether the institutional reluctance to investigate represents deliberate suppression, or simply the ordinary conservatism of resource-constrained scientific bodies. We do not know what is buried in the sediment around and beneath the structure. We do not know whether the straight lines visible in the sonar image are meaningful or incidental. We do not know, most fundamentally, whether the Baltic Sea anomaly is the most important, unexamined discovery of the 21st century, or simply a fascinating rock. And finally, the one that runs beneath all the others, we do not know what it would mean if the anomaly turned out to be something genuinely unprecedented. Not for science, not for history, but for the ordinary understanding that most people carry of the world they live in. The assumption that the seafloor of a well-known sea holds no significant surprises is not just a scientific position, it is a cultural comfort. It is part of the shared agreement that the major discoveries have been made, that the map is essentially complete, that what remains is detail rather than revision. The Baltic Sea anomaly, whatever it is, challenges that comfort. Not because it proves anything extraordinary, but because it demonstrates simply by existing and remaining unexplained that the agreement is less secure than it appears. That perhaps is the most unsettling thing about the object beneath the Baltic. Not its shape, not its dimensions, not the equipment that stopped working above it, or the funding that dried up around it, or the documents with the redacted lines. The most unsettling thing is what it implies about all the seafloor that has not been mapped, all the coordinates that have not been marked, all the sonar sweeps that have not been run. If something like this can sit 300 feet below a sea that human beings have sailed for 3,000 years, what sits beneath the seas that human beings have never truly explored? The Baltic Sea does not give up its dead easily. That is the phrase that mariners in the region have used for centuries, and it carries more truth than metaphor. The cold, low-salinity water that preserves wooden ships also preserves everything else that reaches the bottom. Cloth, leather, rope, food, personal effects. The contents of a sailor's pocket the moment he went over the side in a storm. 300 years ago may still be there, somewhere, in some form, waiting in the silt. The Baltic is a kind of slow, cold library, patient, indiscriminate in its preservation, cataloguing without judgment everything that falls into it. The anomaly, whatever it is, has been catalogued in that library for a very long time. Long enough that the sediment has built up around it, partially burying its edges, softening the sharpness of whatever geometry it originally possessed. Long enough that whatever process created it, geological, military, industrial or otherwise, has passed completely from living memory and perhaps from any memory at all. The sonar image that Peter Lindbergh's team captured in 2011 may be the first record that any human being has made of this structure, or it may be the most recent in a series of records that began long ago and were lost, buried, classified, or simply forgotten in the vast accumulation of human history that surrounds this particular sea. We cannot know. That is the condition the anomaly imposes on us. It does not reveal itself. It simply exists, consistent and circular and silent, at the bottom of a grey sea, on coordinates that were marked in a logbook on a summer afternoon, more than a decade ago, and have not since been revisited with the resources that the question deserves. The distance between those two possibilities is vast, and we have not yet made the journey to close it. The Baltic Sea has a particular quality at night, in winter, when the wind comes down from the Scandinavian interior, and the water turns dark and choppy, and the lights of the coastal cities are small and distant across the waves. Standing at the rail of a ship in those conditions, looking at the surface, and knowing that 300 feet below you something sits on the mud, patient and still and waiting to be understood, produces a feeling that is hard to name precisely. It is not quite fear. It is not quite wonder. It is something in between those two things. The feeling that the world is larger than you thought, and that the largeness is not necessarily comfortable. That the ocean you have crossed 100 times contains things you have not seen. That the maps are less complete than they appear. That the knowledge we carry about the world we live in, the confident, settled, this is what is true knowledge, has gaps in it that are deeper than we acknowledge. Every generation believes it is close to the end of discovery. Every generation is wrong. Columbus believed the Earth had been fully mapped. Darwin's contemporaries believed the fossil record was nearly complete. The physicists of the 1890s believed the major questions of physics had been answered. In every case, what came next overturned those certainties in ways that could not have been predicted from inside the prevailing understanding. The Baltic Sea anomaly may be nothing. It may be a piece of glacially shaped rock that sonar imaging made to look dramatic, and that close inspection will render mundane. It may already have been quietly confirmed as just that by some institution that chose not to publicise its findings because there was nothing to publicise. This is possible. This is in fact the most probable single explanation for what happened. But the thing about the most probable single explanation is that it shares the world with other explanations, and the thing about the Baltic seafloor is that it keeps its own counsel. Whatever is down there, rock or ruin, weapon or wonder, the residue of ice or the remnant of intention, it does not announce itself. It simply sits 300 feet below the grey surface of a sea that has been crossed by human beings for 3,000 years and waits for someone to decide it is worth understanding. Maybe that someone is already planning the dive. Maybe the expedition is being organised right now in some office or research vessel or university department by people who have not yet made the announcement. Maybe the next sonar image, the next descent, the next set of rock samples sent back to a laboratory in Stockholm or Helsinki or Kiel will produce the answer that settles this question once and for all. Or maybe the anomaly will simply remain there, in the dark beneath the Baltic, for another decade and then another, while the world argues about what it is and who should look at it, and what the looking might reveal. The sea does not hurry. It never has. And whatever it is keeping, beneath 300 feet of cold dark water, beneath layers of accumulated sediment, beneath the ordinary surface of an ordinary grey sea, it has been keeping it for a very long time. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the sound of the water carry you, imagine it, the shape of that circle on the sonar screen. The moment Peter Lindbergh leaned in to look at his monitor and saw something that did not belong. The diver's hand, gloved and cold, running along a surface that felt unlike any rock he had touched before. The camera that stopped recording precisely where nothing should have stopped it. The silence of the sea floor unbroken by anything except the distant throb of engines overhead and the slow, imperceptible movement of the water above and the long, patient stillness of whatever lies beneath. Sleep well. The sea holds its secrets tonight, and tonight, at least, so can you. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most persistent mysteries, I want to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's shadows. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It keeps these stories coming. And a huge thank you to Michael for suggesting tonight's topic. This one goes deep. Now let's talk about a secret society that might have changed America forever. Picture this. It's late April in the year 1865. Richmond, Virginia, lies in ruins. Smoke still rises from buildings set ablaze during the evacuation. The Confederate capital has fallen, and Jefferson Davis, president of the dying Confederacy, is fleeing south with whatever remains of his government. In the chaos of that retreat, a train of wagons moves through the darkness, creaking under the weight of heavy cargo. The guards riding alongside are exhausted, but they stay alert. They know what they're protecting. Gold bars wrapped in canvas, silver coins in wooden chests, banknotes and bonds representing fortunes. The final treasury of the Confederate States of America. Everything that remains of a nation that's bleeding to death. History tells us most of that gold was captured, stolen or lost during the desperate retreat. The official records are clear. The case is closed. The Confederate treasury was seized or scattered, and that's the end of it. But what if I told you that eyewitness accounts from that period tell a very different story? What if Union officers testified, under oath, that massive quantities of gold were never recovered? What if there was no clear chain of custody for millions of dollars worth of Confederate assets? What if the math simply doesn't add up, and nobody wants to talk about why? And what if the same name kept appearing in post-war rumours, whispered in backrooms and coded letters? A name that most history textbooks barely mention, if they mention it at all. A name that makes historians uncomfortable when you bring it up at academic conferences. The Knights of the Golden Circle. Tonight, we're going to explore one of America's most enduring conspiracy theories. A secret society that may have planned the Civil War, financed terrorism, and hidden a fortune that could still be buried somewhere in the American South. This isn't fiction. Every event I'm about to describe is documented. The only question is how the pieces fit together. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the secret society the Civil War never buried. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Empire. The year is 1854. Most Americans have never heard of Kansas, Nebraska. The Republican Party is brand new, formed just months earlier by anti-slavery activists who are horrified by the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, a man named George Washington Lafayette Bickley is about to change history in ways that are still being felt today. Bickley was a curious figure, and that's putting it mildly. Officially he was a physician, though his medical credentials were questionable at best. He claimed to have studied in Britain, but no records support this. He styled himself as a professor and academic, but universities had no record of employing him. What he really was, in modern terms, was a con artist, a propagandist, and what we might today call a political operative with dangerous ideas. But he had charisma. People who met him described a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a voice that could fill a room. He could talk for hours without notes, weaving elaborate visions of southern glory and manifest destiny. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to belong to something. They want to belong to something secret, something special, something that makes them feel chosen. In that year, Bickley founded a secret society. He called it the Knights of the Golden Circle. The name wasn't poetic or symbolic. It was literal, and it was terrifying if you understood what it meant. Bickley envisioned a slave-holding empire that would stretch in a massive circle, 2,400 miles in radius, centered on Havana, Cuba. This golden circle would encompass the entire American South, all of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. It would be, in Bickley's feverish vision, a paradise built on slave labour and southern aristocracy. An empire where wealthy white landowners would rule over millions of enslaved people, extracting unlimited wealth from sugar, cotton, and coffee plantations stretching from Virginia to Venezuela. The plan was detailed, disturbingly detailed. Bickley didn't just have a vision, he had maps, he had economic projections, he had military strategies for conquering Mexico and Central America. He had calculated how many enslaved workers would be needed, how much profit could be generated, how the empire would be governed. It sounds insane. It was insane. But here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you. People listened. Important people, wealthy people, powerful people. The Knights of the Golden Circle wasn't some fringe group meeting in basements and wearing silly hats. It was organised like a military operation from day one. The structure was hierarchical and sophisticated. At the top were the castle leaders, men of wealth and influence who recruited members and organised local chapters. Below them were degrees of initiation, each requiring oaths, rituals, and the learning of secret codes and hand signals. Members didn't just join, they were initiated. The ceremonies involved darkness, candles, dramatic oaths sworn on weapons and symbols. New members were told they were joining something ancient and powerful, though in reality the organisation was barely older than they were. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of being part of a brotherhood, a conspiracy, a movement that was going to reshape the world. The Knights learned coded language that allowed them to identify each other and communicate in plain sight. They used hand signs borrowed from Masonic traditions. They organised into local chapters called castles, each with its own treasury, meeting place, and roster of members, and they recruited aggressively, targeting men with influence, money, and military experience. By the year 1860, just 6 years after the organisation's founding, conservative estimates suggest the Knights had over 40,000 members across the South and border states. Some historians think the number was much higher, possibly as many as 60 or 70,000. They had infiltrated southern military units, state legislatures, railroad companies and banks. They had money, influence, and most importantly a plan. The KGC wasn't just talking about secession, they were preparing for it. They were stockpiling weapons. They were identifying targets. They were creating networks that could move information, money and people across state lines without detection. They were building an infrastructure for war before the war had even started. And here's what should really make you think. When the Civil War finally came, when the South seceded and the shooting started, Confederate leaders seemed remarkably prepared. Communication networks were already in place. Supply lines had been thought through. Sympathisers in northern states were already organised and ready to cause problems. How much of that preparedness came from the Knights of the Golden Circle? We'll never know for sure, but the timing is awfully convenient. Chapter 2. The Shadow War. When the Civil War finally erupted in April of 1861 with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, something strange happened to the Knights of the Golden Circle. Officially, publicly, the organisation dissolved. Newspapers that had occasionally mentioned the group suddenly stopped. Meeting halls went quiet. The Knights of the Golden Circle seemed to have vanished into history just as the conflict they had helped create was beginning. But Union intelligence reports tell a very different story. And these weren't conspiracy theories or rumours. These were official military intelligence documents, filed by commanders who were genuinely worried about what they were seeing. The Knights didn't disappear. They simply went underground and changed their names, the way a criminal might use an alias when the law gets too close. Some became the Order of American Knights. Others called themselves the Sons of Liberty, deliberately invoking Revolutionary War imagery to make their treason seem patriotic. Same members, same oaths, same goals, just different letterhead. And throughout the war, accusations followed them like a shadow that wouldn't be shaken off. Union authorities documented case after case of sabotage, particularly in the border states of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. These weren't Confederate states, these were Union territory. But they were full of Southern sympathizers, and more importantly, they were full of Knights. Railroad tracks would be destroyed the night before major troop movements. How did the saboteurs know when trains would be passing? Telegraph lines would be cut at exactly the moments when Union commanders needed to communicate most urgently. Coincidence or inside information? Weapons shipments that should have reached Union armies mysteriously disappeared in transit. Where did those weapons go? Were they sold? Hidden? Sent south to Confederate forces? Draft resistance seemed too organised to be spontaneous. When the Union implemented conscription in 1863, riots erupted in multiple northern cities at almost the same time. That takes coordination. That takes planning. That takes an existing network of people willing to act together. Union commanders, particularly in the Western Theatre, became convinced they were fighting two wars simultaneously. One war against the Confederate Army in the South, which was difficult enough, and another war against a secret network operating in their own backyard, behind their own lines, sabotaging their efforts from within. The most dramatic case came in the summer of 1864 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Union authorities had been investigating suspected KGC activity for months. They were building a case, gathering evidence, identifying members, and in August they finally had enough to act. They arrested Harrison H. Dodd, identified as a high-ranking leader in what was now calling itself the Order of the American Knights. Dodd was a lawyer, a respected member of the community. He had money and connections. But Union investigators had evidence, they claimed, that he was planning something much bigger than simple draft resistance. The charges were staggering. Dodd was accused of planning to break Confederate prisoners out of northern prison camps and arm them for attacks on Union cities. The plan allegedly involved coordinating simultaneous uprisings in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, timed to coincide with Confederate military operations in the South. The goal was nothing less than forcing the Union to fight a two-front war, to divide their forces and potentially tip the balance toward Confederate victory. If even half of these charges were true, it was one of the most ambitious plots of the entire war. Dodd was placed under heavy guard in Indianapolis, awaiting a military tribunal that would almost certainly result in his execution for treason. And then he escaped, just walked out, disappeared, vanished like smoke. The official explanation was embarrassingly vague. Guards were supposedly bribed or distracted. Dodd had help from someone, obviously, but who? And where did he go afterward? Harrison H. Dodd was never found again. He didn't turn up dead. He wasn't captured later in the war. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record. A high-profile prisoner, accused of plotting massive domestic terrorism, just disappeared. How does that happen? How does a man awaiting trial for treason against the United States simply vanish in the middle of the largest war in American history? Who helped him? Where did he go? Did he flee to Confederate territory? Did he hide in plain sight under a new identity? Did he continue his activities from the shadows? The official records don't say. They can't say, because nobody knows. Or if anyone knew, they never told. But investigators at the time began to suspect something that would have been almost too frightening to admit publicly. The Knights of the Golden Circle, or whatever they were calling themselves now, hadn't been planning just for war. They had been planning for defeat. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a struggle that wouldn't end with military victory or defeat, but would continue for years, maybe decades afterward. They were preparing for the long game, and that meant they needed to survive as an organisation regardless of who won the war. Chapter 3. The Gold That Vanished. Let's go back to that night in April of 1865. Richmond, Virginia has fallen to Union forces. The Confederate capital, the beating heart of the rebellion, is now behind enemy lines. Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The war is over, at least for all practical purposes. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, is fleeing south with what remains of his cabinet. They're moving fast, trying desperately to reach Texas or Mexico before Union cavalry catches them. It's a sad end for a government that once controlled 11 states and fielded massive armies. Now it's reduced to a handful of officials and guards, riding through the night, hoping to outrun history. With them travels the Confederate treasury or what's left of it. Wagons loaded with boxes and barrels, guards posted at all times, everything that remains of a nation's wealth, being hauled down muddy roads in the darkness. On May 10th, 1865, Union troops finally catch up with Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. The capture itself is almost anticlimactic. Davis, exhausted and despairing, is taken without a fight. Union officers search the camp and seize the assets they find. Some gold coins, some silver. Personal effects belonging to Davis and his family. They load it all up, document what they've captured, and send Davis north to imprisonment. Case closed. War over. The Confederate treasury has been recovered, except it hasn't. Not really. Because here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply suspicious. The amount of gold and silver seized at Irwinville didn't match Confederate financial records. Not even close. Not within several $1 million of close. Confederate ledgers indicated the government had received substantial foreign loans, particularly from British and French sympathisers who believed in the Southern cause and saw profit in supporting it. They had held massive payroll funds to pay Confederate soldiers and officers. They had controlled private assets from Southern banks and wealthy donors who had literally given their fortunes to the cause. Ships had run the Union blockade carrying gold. Bonds had been sold. Wealth had been concentrated. Where did it all go? Union authorities interrogated Davis and his associates extensively. They weren't gentle about it. They wanted answers. They needed answers. The American people were demanding answers. Where was the Confederate gold? The responses they got were vague, contradictory, or simply non-existent. Some prisoners claimed the money had been spent during the long retreat from Richmond to Georgia. Spent on what? Food? Supplies? With what they had to show for it? Others said it had been stolen by deserting soldiers in the chaos of the Confederate collapse. Possible, but that would mean finding huge amounts of gold on random deserters, and that didn't happen. A few witnesses gave a different explanation, and this one kept coming up in different interviews, from different people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. They said the money had been distributed to various trusted officers with orders to hide it until the South could rise again. Hide it geographically. Spread it out. Make it impossible to find or seize all at once. That last explanation kept coming up. Hide it until the South could rise again. Not spend it. Not secure it. Hide it. As if defeat was not the end of the conflict, but merely an intermission. Witnesses later came forward with stories that gave texture to these vague explanations. A wagon train guarded by men in Confederate uniforms, splitting off from the main column near the Georgia-South Carolina border and heading into the wilderness. Where were they going? Nobody followed to find out. Gold bars being loaded onto mules in the dead of night while the main camp slept. Who ordered it? Who received it? Trusted officers receiving sealed orders from Davis himself and then disappearing into the countryside, never to rejoin the retreating government. And when investigators tried to track down these officers, tried to follow these leads, they hit walls. The men involved? Many were later identified as former Knights of the Golden Circle members, not suspected members, documented members whose names appeared on captured KGC membership rolls from earlier in the war. Southern bankers with secret affiliations who had managed the Confederacy's finances. Confederate intelligence officers who had spent the war running covert operations. These weren't random choices. These were men selected for a reason. Men who could keep secrets. Men who belonged to organisations that valued loyalty unto death. By 1866, barely a year after the war's end, rumours were spreading across the South like a fever. The gold was out there somewhere, buried in caches scattered across multiple states, hidden in caves known only to a few, divided among trusted guardians who had sworn oaths to protect it with their lives, and all of it allegedly marked with symbols, protected by coded maps, and defended by men who would kill to keep the secret. The treasure hunt had begun, and it would claim lives for decades to come. Chapter 4. Symbols in the Woods. Over the next several decades, something strange started happening across the American South. People began finding things in the woods, in their fields, carved into rocks on their property. Strange symbols, deliberate markings, messages from the past written in a language most people couldn't read. The symbols were consistent enough that researchers eventually compiled catalogues trying to decode them. Hearts with arrows pointing in specific directions, turtles with marks on their shells indicating numbers or distances, owls with one eye open, turkey tracks arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural, snakes forming circles or figure eights, all arranged in ways that suggested purpose, meaning, direction. These weren't random scratches made by bored travellers. These were carved with tools, positioned in relation to landmarks, often protected from weather by overhangs or deliberate placement. Someone had spent time on them. Someone had meant them to last. Someone had intended them to be found by people who would know what they meant. Were these markers pointing to buried Confederate gold? Or were they elaborate hoaxes created by con artists preying on Southern desperation and nostalgia? The problem with dismissing them as hoaxes is simple and disturbing. People who found these markers often died. Not eventually, not of old age, suspiciously, quickly, under circumstances that didn't quite add up. I'm not exaggerating for effect. There's a pattern in the historical record that's genuinely disturbing when you see it laid out. A farmer in rural Georgia finds a carved stone on his property while ploughing. It's got symbols he doesn't recognise, but they're clearly man-made and look old. He mentions it at church the following Sunday, excited about the possibility of finding treasure. 2 weeks later, he's found dead in the woods, supposedly from a hunting accident. Except he wasn't carrying a rifle. His rifle was found at home, so who shot him? A prospector in Arkansas discovers a map hidden in the lining of an old Confederate uniform he bought from a widow. The map shows landmarks he recognises, symbols he doesn't. He starts asking around town about the symbols, showing the map to people he trusts. His cabin burns down 3 weeks later with him inside. The fire inspector rules it an accident, despite finding evidence the door had been nailed shut from the outside. A family in Missouri begins digging in a suspicious location on their land after the grandfather claims he remembers Confederate soldiers burying something there during the war. They find a stone marker with KGC symbols. They dig deeper. Armed men arrive at their property one night, masked and carrying weapons. They order the family to stop digging, to forget what they've seen, and to never speak of it again. The family stops digging. They don't report it to the sheriff. When asked about it years later, they claim they don't remember what the armed men looked like or how many there were. They're terrified decades after the fact. The newspapers of the late 1800s are full of these stories, particularly in Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky and Georgia. Local papers would run articles about mysterious deaths, strange intimidation, and treasure hunting gone wrong. And here's the unsettling part. In most cases, local sheriffs didn't investigate thoroughly. Or if they did, the cases were quietly dropped without explanation. Why? What pressure was being applied? Who had enough influence in multiple states to make law enforcement back off repeatedly? The implication is obvious but terrifying. Someone was guarding something, and they had enough power, enough reach, enough organisational capability to intimidate local law enforcement in multiple states across multiple decades. That's not a random group of treasure hoarders. That's an organisation, a network, a conspiracy that functioned across state lines and across generations. In the 1890s, newspapers in Texas and Arkansas ran multiple stories about mysterious armed men forcing landowners to abandon property. These weren't robberies. The armed men didn't steal anything. They didn't want the land, they just wanted the residents gone, immediately and permanently. No explanations, no negotiations. Just leave and don't come back. Some families complied. They packed up and left, abandoning property they'd owned for decades. Others tried to stand their ground and found themselves facing escalating harassment. Livestock killed, barns burned, warning shots fired at night. Eventually everyone left. Who were these men? What were they protecting? Were they remnants of the Knights of the Golden Circle, still operating decades after the Civil War? Were they descendants of the original knights, carrying on some kind of guardian tradition passed down through families? Were they hired muscle being paid by someone with resources and a vested interest in keeping certain areas undisturbed? Or were they something else entirely? Something that had evolved from the knights but wasn't quite the same? Organisation anymore? Chapter 5. From Knights to Klan. We need to talk about timing. And when I say we need to talk about it, I mean this is one of those historical coincidences that's almost too convenient to be a coincidence. December of 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee, just 8 months after the war's end. 6 Confederate veterans are sitting around, bored and restless. The war is over. They lost. The world they knew is gone. The social order they fought to preserve is being dismantled by Reconstruction. They're young men with military training and no purpose, so they form a social club. At least that's what they claim it is. They're bored, they say. They want something to do. They create elaborate costumes, mysterious rituals, grandiose titles that sound impressive but mean nothing. They ride through town at night in sheets and hoods, pretending to be ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. It's all just pranks and theatre, they insist. They call themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name comes from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. Interesting choice of words, isn't it? Circle. At first, it really did seem to be just a social club. Costumes and midnight rides. Pranks designed to startle freedmen and carpetbaggers. It was juvenile, offensive, but not yet organised violence. But within 2 years, something changed. The play acting stopped being play. The social club transformed into something much darker, much more dangerous. A terrorist organisation dedicated to violently resisting Reconstruction and maintaining white supremacy through intimidation, assault, and murder. The transformation was remarkably quick and remarkably organised. Local chapters appeared across the South almost simultaneously. They had uniform rituals, similar costumes, and coordinated tactics. They operated with military precision. When they decided to target someone, the attacks would happen on the same night in multiple counties, making it impossible for limited law enforcement to respond effectively. This wasn't organic growth. This was activation of an existing network. The early Klan had a structure that looked awfully, disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied Confederate secret societies. Secret oaths sworn in darkness, coded language that allowed members to identify each other, local chapters operating independently but following central guidance, a hierarchical command system with elaborate titles, blood initiation ceremonies, penalties for breaking oaths that were clearly stated and genuinely frightening. Sound like anyone we've been talking about? Here's where conspiracy theorists get very interested, and honestly, their interest isn't entirely unjustified. Several early Klan leaders had documented ties to Confederate intelligence networks during the war. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan's first Grand Wizard, had commanded cavalry units that included known KGC members. He had experience with covert operations, raids behind enemy, lines, and the kind of decentralized command structure that secret organizations require. Other early Klan leaders had backgrounds in secret fraternal organizations. They knew how to create rituals that bound men together. They understood the psychology of secret societies, how shared secrets create loyalty stronger than law or conscience. And the Klan's rapid spread across the South followed patterns that looked less like spontaneous organisation and more like activation of an existing network. It was as if someone had a list of trusted men in each county, men who could be relied upon to organise and lead, men who already knew how to operate in secret, men who had done this before. Could the Knights of the Golden Circle have simply rebranded again? Could the KGC's ideology, infrastructure, membership roles, and yes, hidden wealth have been absorbed into the Klan? There's no smoking gun, no document that says, "Dear Klan, love the Knights of the Golden Circle. Here's our member list, our operational procedures, and some gold to fund your activities." Historical conspiracies rarely leave convenient paper trails, but the circumstantial evidence is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Both organisations had essentially identical goals: preserve Southern power structures, resist federal authority by any means necessary, and maintain racial hierarchies through violence if needed. Both used secret rituals and violent intimidation as their primary tools. Both operated through decentralised cells that were difficult for authorities to infiltrate or destroy. Both had support from local elites who provided protection and resources, and both had financial resources that seemed to exceed what you'd expect from their claimed origins. Where did the early Klan get its funding? Sheets and robes cost money, horses cost money, arms cost money. Coordinating across multiple states costs money. Someone was paying for all of this, and it wasn't membership dues from poor farmers. How did it spread so quickly across such a large geographic area? Who was coordinating the violence? Who was training local leaders? Who was providing the operational manuals that made different Klan chapters operate so similarly? The official histories don't have good answers to these questions. Maybe because the truth was too disturbing to admit. Maybe because acknowledging a direct link between the KGC and the Klan would have meant admitting that Reconstruction was facing an organised insurgency with deep roots and significant resources, not just random violence from sore losers. That would have been a terrifying admission for the federal government to make. It would have meant the Civil War hadn't really ended. It had just changed tactics. Chapter 6. The Lincoln Question. We have to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the assassination at the theatre. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theatre in Washington, District of Columbia. The play is Our American Cousin, a comedy that's popular with wartime audiences looking for distraction. President Abraham Lincoln is in the presidential box with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. They're relaxed. The war is essentially over. Lincoln can finally breathe. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth enters the presidential box. He's an actor. He's been in this theatre many times. The staff knows him. Nobody stops him. He knows the play well enough to time his approach for a moment when the audience will be laughing, covering the sound of his entry. Booth shoots President Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. Lincoln slumps forward, mortally wounded. He'll die the next morning, never regaining consciousness. Booth leaps from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the landing, and shouts something the witnesses can't quite agree on. Then he limps out of the theatre and disappears into the Washington night. For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth evades capture. Let that sink in. The most wanted man in America, having just committed the most significant assassination in the nation's history, manages to avoid capture for nearly 2 weeks. How? He moves through a network of safe houses. He crosses the Potomac River into Virginia. He finds people willing to hide him, feed him, treat his injuries. He has contacts, resources, and most importantly, a plan that extends beyond the assassination itself. This wasn't a spontaneous act by a lone madman. This was planned. This was coordinated. This had infrastructure behind it. Eventually, Union cavalry tracks Booth down to a tobacco barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. They surround the barn. They demand his surrender. Booth refuses. The barn is set on fire to force him out. In the chaos and smoke, a shot rings out. Booth falls, mortally wounded. He dies a few hours later. The official story is that Sergeant Boston Corbett, acting against orders, shot Booth to prevent his escape. Corbett claimed divine instruction to fire. He was never punished. Some witnesses said it looked like Booth shot himself. The truth died with everyone in that barn. The official investigation concluded that Booth was part of a conspiracy, but a relatively small one. A handful of co-conspirators, all Confederate sympathizers, acting largely on their own initiative to strike a blow against the Union government. 8 people were arrested, tried and convicted. 4 were hanged. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not really. It never has been. Researchers have spent over a century and a half picking apart Booth's movements, his contacts and his resources, and some of what they've found is genuinely troubling, raising questions that official history has never satisfactorily answered. Booth had connections to known Confederate intelligence operatives, not suspected connections, documented ones. He had travelled to Canada in the months before the Yale assassination, where Confederate agents were known to be operating. He had money, more money than an actor should have had. Where did it come from? His escape route followed pathways that matched documented Underground Railroad routes used by Southern agents during the war. Not approximately, exactly. The same houses, the same contacts, the same methods. Someone had planned this route before, tested it, confirmed it would work. The safe houses that sheltered Booth weren't random Confederate sympathizers. They had ties to secret societies and organized Southern resistance networks. Some had connections, documented in later research, to men who had been Knights of the Golden Circle members before the war. And here's the really interesting part that conspiracy researchers focus on. The assistance network Booth used looked remarkably similar to the escape tactics attributed to the Knights of the Golden Circle during the war. The organisation, the security protocols, the way information was compartmentalized so that each link in the chain only knew the next step, not the whole plan. This is sophisticated tradecraft. This is how intelligence organizations operate. This isn't how a random group of angry Southerners would organize an assassination plot. Did the Knights help plan Lincoln's assassination? Did they provide Booth with resources, training and support? Were they part of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government and create chaos that might somehow revive Confederate hopes? The conspiracy theorists point to several disturbing coincidences. The assassination happened just days after Lee's surrender, when Confederate cause was clearly lost. Why then? If it was about changing the war's outcome, it was too late. But if it was about revenge, or about creating a martyred president whose death would poison Reconstruction and benefit Southern resistance, then the timing makes perfect sense. Official investigations never proved KGC involvement. They never even seriously investigated it. But they also never fully ruled it out. The evidence was circumstantial, fragmentary, and often destroyed or lost. What we're left with is a question mark, a big one. And the more you look at the details, the more you notice the gaps in the official story, the bigger that question mark becomes. Chapter 7. The 20th Century Ghosts. You might think that by the 1900s the Knights of the Golden Circle would be ancient history, a relic of the Civil War era, as dead as the Confederacy itself, something that belonged in dusty archives and academic dissertations, not in the living world. But strange things kept happening. Little things, easily dismissed individually but disturbing when you see them as a pattern. Throughout the early 20th century, occasional reports surfaced that didn't quite make sense. Men in small southern towns identifying themselves as knights to people they thought they could trust. Why would anyone claim membership in a defunct organisation unless it wasn't actually defunct? Old Confederate symbols appearing in unexpected places, carved into the foundations of new buildings, or incorporated into business logos in ways that seemed deliberately coded. Bank records tied to defunct Southern trusts that seemed to have more money than they should, funds that appeared to grow over time rather than depleting. In 1934, something happened in Oklahoma that encapsulates the entire mystery. A man named William, a carpenter and amateur historian, was renovating an old house that had supposedly been built by a Confederate veteran. He was tearing out a wall when he found something hidden in the cavity between the studs. A map, hand-drawn on aged paper, sealed in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The map showed local landmarks, some of which still existed, others that William had to research to identify, and it was covered in symbols, hearts, turtles, owls, the same symbols that had been appearing on treasure maps and stone markers for 70 years. William was excited. He was careful. He didn't immediately announce his find to the world. He showed it to a few trusted friends. He started researching the symbols, trying to decode them. He planned an expedition to some of the marked locations. He was methodical, thoughtful, doing everything right. 3 weeks later, William was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was listed as heart attack. He was 32 years old, in good health, with no family history of heart problems. He'd been working in his garage when it happened, apparently. Alone. No witnesses. The map disappeared. When William's widow looked for it among his possessions, it was gone. She knew he'd been keeping it in a locked drawer in his workshop. The drawer was still locked. The map wasn't there. She never reported it missing. When researchers tried to interview her years later about her husband's death, she refused to discuss it. She was afraid, decades after the fact. You could see it in her eyes, people said. She was still afraid. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the century. Someone finds something, maybe an old map, maybe a journal, maybe carved symbols on their property. They get excited, they tell people, they start investigating. Then suddenly they don't want to talk anymore. Or they can't. In 1957, a man in Arkansas claimed he'd found a carved stone with KGC symbols while clearing land. He brought it to the local historical society, excited to share his discovery. The society photographed it, documented it, and asked if they could keep it for further study. He agreed. 2 weeks later, He returned and demanded the stone back, visibly shaken. The Society returned it. He destroyed it with a sledgehammer in the parking lot, then left and never spoke of it again. Historical Society members later said he looked terrified, like someone had put a genuine fear into him. In 1973, a construction crew in East Texas accidentally uncovered what appeared to be a small buried vault while excavating for a shopping centre foundation. Inside were Confederate coins, personal effects, and documents. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid. The crew foreman called the site supervisor. The supervisor made some phone calls. Within hours, men in suits arrived and took control of the site. The crew was told to forget what they'd seen, and were given substantial bonuses to ensure their silence. The vault and its contents disappeared. The shopping centre was built. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the artefacts or who those men in suits were. The treasure hunters who survived these encounters learned an important lesson. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media, though that didn't exist for most of this history. You don't give interviews. You don't write books. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land, and you hope nobody asks too many questions. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why this particular cache has gone undiscovered for over 100 years, why no one else has found it, and whether maybe, just maybe, it was left unfound for a reason. Whether someone is still keeping track, still watching, still guarding secrets their great-great-grandfathers swore to protect. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades, the ones who are still alive and still willing to talk, they all tell similar stories. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match documented KGC codes. The location makes historical sense. They'll plan an expedition. And then someone shows up. Could be a friendly local who warns them the property owner is litigious. Could be someone claiming to represent historical preservation interests. Could be people who don't bother with explanations, who just make it very clear through body language and implication that moving along would be the smart choice. It happens too often to be coincidence, too consistently across too many years in too many locations to be random chance. Chapter 8. The Gaps That Remain Here's. The fundamental problem with the Knights of the Golden Circle story, and it's a problem that should bother anyone who values historical truth. We know they existed. That's not in dispute. We have membership rolls recovered from raids during the Civil War. We have meeting minutes captured by Union forces. We have contemporary newspaper accounts describing their activities. We have court documents from wartime trials of suspected members. The Knights of the Golden Circle were real. We know they were large, well-organised, and had significant influence in southern and border states. That's also thoroughly documented. Estimates of 40 to 60,000 members aren't wild speculation. They're based on captured documents, testimony from defectors, and Union intelligence reports compiled by people with no reason to exaggerate. We know they had money. Membership dues, sure, but also backing from wealthy southern planters and businessmen who saw the organisation as serving their interests. They had the resources to publish newspapers, fund expeditions, and maintain a network of meeting halls across multiple states. What we don't know is what happened to them after the war, and that gap in the historical record isn't just suspicious, it's gaping. It's the kind of hole that swallows entire conspiracy theories, and still has room for more. Most KGC documents were destroyed. Whether deliberately or through the chaos of war, the organisation's records largely vanished. We're not talking about a few missing ledgers. We're talking about entire archives that should exist but don't. Membership rolls that should list thousands of names just gone. Financial records that should show where money came from and where it went disappeared. Correspondence that should reveal the organisation's plans and operations destroyed or lost. Confederate files were burned as Richmond fell. That's documented. The Confederate government ordered the destruction of sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But which documents were considered most sensitive? Which were prioritised for destruction? Were KGC files among them? We don't know, because the records of what was destroyed were also destroyed. Post-war America had powerful reasons to bury the past and move forward. The country was exhausted. Hundreds of thousands dead, the economy shattered, the social order completely upended. There was a genuine, understandable desire to just stop fighting and start rebuilding. Admitting that a large, well-funded secret society had survived the war and might still be operating would have been devastating to that effort. It would undermine everything Reconstruction was trying to accomplish. It would expose federal failures to control domestic threats. It would raise uncomfortable questions about missing Confederate assets and who might have access to them. It would suggest that the war hadn't really ended, just changed forms. So the official story became simple, clean, reassuring. The Knights of the Golden Circle were a pre-war conspiracy that faded away when their dreams of a southern empire died at Appomattox. They disbanded. Their members went home. Some joined other organisations like the Klan, but the KGC itself ceased to exist. End of story. Clean, simple, reassuring. Probably not true. Because here's what doesn't make sense about that narrative. Organisations don't usually announce when they disband, especially secret organisations. They don't take out newspaper ads saying the Knights of the Golden Circle are officially dissolved, thank you for your support. They just go quiet. And going quiet doesn't mean ceasing to exist. It just means becoming invisible. And there's another problem with the official narrative. The Knights had been planning for Confederate defeat since at least 1863, possibly earlier. There's evidence of this in captured correspondence. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a protracted struggle. They were hiding resources and building networks designed to survive military defeat. Why would an organisation that had spent years preparing for In November of the year 2000, a user with the handle TimeTravel0 appeared on a small online forum dedicated to time travel theory. The posts were technical, confident, and oddly specific. Within weeks, the user changed their name to John Titor and began making claims that would haunt researchers for decades. This is not a story about whether time travel is real. This is a story about information that appeared before it should have been possible to know it. About technical knowledge posted online that would not be publicly confirmed until years later. About a pattern of details so consistent that dismissing them requires almost as much effort as believing them. What follows is an investigation into one of the internet's most persistent mysteries. Not because the evidence is conclusive, but because it refuses to be easily explained away. The internet in the year 2000 was fundamentally different from what exists today. Broadband was rare. Most users connected through dial-up modems that screamed and hissed before establishing connection. Social media did not exist in any recognisable form. Forums were isolated communities, small islands of discussion where the same few dozen people might interact for years without ever knowing each other's real names. It was in this environment that something unusual happened, something that would generate more questions than answers for the next 2 decades. Chapter 1. The Man Who Appeared Online. The Time Travel Institute was one of several forums where enthusiasts discussed the theoretical physics of temporal displacement. Most participants were amateur theorists, science fiction fans, or curious individuals exploring ideas at the margins of accepted science. Discussions ranged from serious academic papers to wild speculation about grandfather paradoxes and bootstrap loops. On November 2nd, 2000, a new user appeared. The handle was Time Travelled Zero. The first post was simple, almost tentative. The user asked about the basics of time travel theory, seemingly gauging the community's level of sophistication. Within days, the tone shifted. Time Traveller Zero began answering questions rather than asking them. The posts were different from typical forum content. They lacked the breathless excitement of science fiction fans or the defensive posturing of people trying to prove fringe theories. The writing was calm, procedural, almost bureaucratic. The user wrote like someone filing a technical report. By November 21st, the user had changed their handle to John Titor. They explained that they were a soldier from the year 2038, sent back in time on a specific military assignment. The mission was not dramatic. It did not involve preventing wars or assassinating historical figures. It was a retrieval operation. Titor claimed he had been sent to the year 1975 to obtain an IBM 5100 computer. This machine, he explained, contained specific capabilities that were needed in his time. After collecting the computer, he had stopped in the year 2000 to visit family and to see the world before a series of catastrophic events that he claimed would reshape American society. The story was elaborate, but the internet had seen elaborate stories before. What made Titor unusual was his willingness to engage. He did not simply drop his claims and disappear, he stayed. He answered hundreds of questions over the course of 5 months. He provided technical diagrams. He discussed physics, sociology, and history. He described daily life in his time with mundane detail that seemed inconsistent with fiction. When users asked about future technology, he did not describe flying cars or utopian cities. He described a world that had regressed in some ways. Centralized infrastructure had failed. Communities were smaller, more localized. Technology existed but was simpler, more rugged, designed for reliability rather than advancement. He mentioned that music was still created, but distribution had changed. He said people grew their own food more often. He described a culture that had been through conflict and had emerged more cautious, more self-reliant, less trusting of large institutions. These details felt real in a way that science fiction often does not. They were boring. They were human scale. They suggested experience rather than imagination. Titor posted photographs. One showed the temporal displacement unit installed in the back of a vehicle. The image was grainy, taken with the low-resolution digital cameras available at the time. The device looked industrial, almost crude. Banks of equipment, cooling systems, control panels. It did not resemble Hollywood's sleek time machines. It looked like something built by engineers working under military constraints. He also posted hand-drawn diagrams explaining how the machine worked. The drawings were technical, but not polished. They looked like field notes, sketches made by someone who understood the mechanics, but was not a professional illustrator. The diagrams included labels, measurements and notations about gravitational fields and particle acceleration. Throughout his time on the forums, Titor maintained a consistent persona. He was polite but not warm. He answered questions directly but did not volunteer unnecessary information. He acknowledged skepticism without becoming defensive. When people called him a liar or a fraud, he responded that he understood their position and that he did not require belief. This restraint was unusual. Most hoaxes escalate. They become more dramatic, more desperate for validation. Titor did the opposite. He became more measured as time went on, as if the novelty of the conversation had worn off and he was simply fulfilling an obligation. On March 24, 2001, John Titor posted his final message. It was brief. He thanked the community for their questions and stated that he would be leaving. He did not specify where or when he was going. He did not promise to return. He simply stopped posting, and that was the end. No dramatic farewell, no final proof offered. Just silence. Chapter 2. The specifics that raised eyebrows. What separated John Titor from countless other internet mysteries was the depth and consistency of his technical knowledge. He did not just claim to have travelled through time, he explained in considerable detail how it was done. The device he described was called a C204 temporal displacement unit. It was manufactured, he said, by General Electric in the year 2034. The unit weighed approximately 500 pounds and required a vehicle for transport. Titor initially used a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette convertible, but later switched to a four-wheel drive truck, for practical reasons related to the gravitational effects of the device. The machine operated, according to Titor, by creating two microsingularities. These were not naturally occurring black holes but artificially generated ones, created through particle acceleration and magnetic containment. The singularities were held in a stable configuration by an electron injection manifold and a gravity sensor array. When activated, the singularities would generate an intense gravitational field around the vehicle. This field would warp space-time in accordance with Einstein's theory of general relativity. By manipulating the rotation and position of the singularities, the operator could control the direction and magnitude of temporal displacement. Titor referenced Kerr black holes specifically. These are rotating black holes, first described mathematically by Roy Kerr in 1963 as a solution to Einstein's field equations. Unlike Schwarzschild black holes, which are non-rotating and have a single event horizon, Kerr black holes have two event horizons, and an ergosphere where space-time itself is dragged around the singularity. The ergosphere is critical. In theory, it is possible to extract energy from a Kerr black hole through a process called the Penrose process, proposed by Roger Penrose in 1969. Titor suggested that his machine exploited similar principles, using the frame-dragging effect of rotating singularities to achieve temporal displacement. This was not pseudoscience. Frame-dragging is a real phenomenon. It was predicted by Einstein and later confirmed by experiments such as Gravity Probe B, launched by NASA in 2004. The idea that rotating masses can drag space-time around them is accepted physics. Titor also discussed the concept of closed time-like curves, or CTCs. These are paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, theoretically allowing an object to return to an earlier point in time. CTCs are solutions to the equations of general relativity under specific conditions, such as near-rotating black holes, or in the presence of exotic matter with negative energy density. The mathematics Titor referenced were legitimate. The terminology was correct. The concepts were grounded in real theoretical physics, not invented jargon. This level of accuracy is difficult to achieve without a strong background in relativity and cosmology. But Titor went further. He explained that time travel did not occur within a single timeline. Instead, each journey resulted in movement to a parallel world line. He described this using what he called the divergence percentage. Travel back 1 year, and you might diverge by 0.1%. Travel back 30 years, and the divergence could be 1 or 2%. This model aligned with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, first proposed by Hugh Everett III in his doctoral dissertation at Princeton in 1957. Everett suggested that every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each representing a different outcome. No wave function collapse occurs. All possibilities are realized in separate, non-communicating universes. Titor was applying this framework to time travel. In his model, travelling back in time was equivalent to moving from one branch of reality to another. You could not change your own past because you were never in your own past. You were in a nearly identical but separate world line. This solved the grandfather paradox elegantly. If you travelled back and prevented your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you would not cease to exist. You would simply be in a world line where you were never born. Your original world line would remain unchanged, still containing a version of you who travelled back. The implications were profound. It meant that time travellers could not prevent disasters in their own timeline. They could only create new timelines where those disasters did not occur. Every action in the past would create a branching point, a new universe diverging from the original. Titor claimed that his machine had a gravitational lock that prevented displacement of more than approximately 60 years. He said this was a safety feature, designed to avoid excessive divergence. The further you travelled, the more different the destination world line would be from your origin. He also explained that the process was not instantaneous. The journey involved what he called a gravity field that ramped up over time. The operator would experience a pulling sensation, followed by a brief period of disorientation as space-time reconfigured. Upon arrival, the field would dissipate, and the vehicle would be in the new time and place. The energy requirements, according to Titor, were substantial but manageable. The device drew power from a small but high-output source, possibly a compact fusion reactor or a contained antimatter reaction. He did not specify, suggesting that some details were classified even in his time. Throughout his explanations, Titor maintained a consistent voice. He was not evangelical. He did not insist that people believe him. He presented information as if filing a report for an audience of engineers. When asked questions beyond his expertise, he admitted he did not know. When challenged on physics, he engaged thoughtfully rather than deflecting. This consistency is difficult to maintain over hundreds of posts spanning 5 months. It requires either genuine knowledge or exceptional discipline. Chapter 3. Predictions made in advance. John Titor made numerous statements about the future. Some were vague, some were specific, and some aligned with events that occurred years after his posts, raising uncomfortable questions about how he could have known. He described a future marked by civil conflict in the United States. He said that by 2015, tensions between rural and urban populations would escalate into something resembling a civil war. He described it not as a traditional war with clear battle lines, but as a slow-burning conflict characterized by federal overreach, local resistance, and increasing breakdowns in trust. In the year 2000, this was not a mainstream narrative. The nation had just elected George W. Bush in a contested election, but the political climate was not yet defined by the extreme polarization that would characterize later years. Social media had not yet amplified divisions. The idea of civil conflict seemed remote to most people. Titor also mentioned that the conflict would be tied to issues of civil liberties and federal power. He suggested that a crisis, possibly related to terrorism or security concerns, would lead to increased government control. Citizens in rural areas, he claimed, would resist this control, leading to fractures that would deepen over time. By 2001, the September 11th attacks occurred. The Patriot Act was passed. Surveillance expanded. Debates about civil liberties intensified. Whether Titor predicted this or simply observed trends already in motion is unclear, but the alignment is notable. He predicted that CERN would discover miniature black holes around 2001. This did not happen exactly as stated. However, the Large Hadron Collider, which began operations in 2008, was designed in part to test theories related to micro-black holes and higher dimensional physics. Some theoretical models suggested that such black holes could be created, though none have been detected. Titor's claim about CERN is often cited as a failed prediction, but it is worth noting that his timeline divergence model allows for such failures. If his world line was 1 or 2% different from ours, events might occur at slightly different times, or not at all. He also mentioned mad cow disease. At the time, it was already a known issue, particularly in the United Kingdom, but Titor suggested it would become a more significant problem in the United States. By 2003, the first case of mad cow disease was confirmed in a cow in Washington state. The discovery led to widespread panic, beef recalls, and a temporary ban on American beef exports. Again, this was not a dramatic prediction. Mad cow disease was already in the news. But Titor's emphasis on it, in 2000, before it became a major American issue, shows a pattern of being slightly ahead of the curve. He described advances in computer technology that matched later developments. He mentioned multi-core processors, distributed computing, and the importance of legacy system compatibility. He said that in his time, older programming languages and systems were still in use because they were reliable and well understood. This aligns with the reality of enterprise computing, where COBOL and other legacy languages remain critical decades after being developed. Titor also discussed the internet. He said it would become less centralised, more fragmented. He mentioned that in his time, communities used localized networks rather than relying on massive global platforms. This has not fully occurred, but trends toward decentralized systems, mesh networks, and blockchain technologies reflect movement in that direction. Perhaps most unsettling were his social predictions. He described increasing distrust in institutions. He mentioned that people would become more self-sufficient, growing their own food and relying on local communities. He said media would fracture, with people choosing sources that aligned with their existing beliefs. These trends have accelerated dramatically since 2000. The rise of social media, the decline of traditional journalism, the growth of political polarization, and the emphasis on self-reliance and preparedness all align with Titor's descriptions. None of this is proof. Trends can be observed and extrapolated. A skilled futurist could make educated guesses. But the consistency of Titor's vision, particularly for someone writing in the year 2000, is striking. Chapter 4. The IBM connection, the single most compelling piece of evidence in the John Titor case, involves a computer manufactured in the 1970s. Titor claimed that his mission was to retrieve an IBM 5100 portable computer. This was not a random choice. He stated specifically that the IBM 5100 had a unique feature that was not publicly documented. The machine could emulate and translate older programming languages used in mainframe systems from the 1960s and 70s. This capability, he said, was critical in his time. Legacy systems in 2038 still relied on code written decades earlier, and the IBM 5100 was one of the few machines capable of debugging and translating that code. Without it, critical infrastructure would fail. In the year 2000, the IBM 5100 was an obscure piece of technology. Released in 1975, it was one of the first portable computers, though at £50, portability was relative. It was expensive, marketed primarily to businesses and engineers. By 2000, it was largely forgotten, a curiosity for vintage computing enthusiasts but not widely discussed. Titor's claim about the undocumented feature seemed oddly specific. Why choose this particular computer? Why claim it had a secret capability? Years later, engineers who had worked on the IBM 5100 began to speak publicly. One of them was Bob Dubke, who confirmed in interviews that the machine did indeed have an undocumented emulation feature. It could read and translate code from older IBM mainframe systems, including those written in APL and BASIC. This capability was intentionally kept quiet. IBM did not advertise it because they did not want competitors to know. It was a feature built in for corporate clients who needed backward compatibility, but was not included in user manuals or marketing materials. The question becomes unavoidable. How did John Titor know this in the year 2000? If he was a hoaxer, he would have needed access to information that was not publicly available. He would have needed to speak with IBM engineers or find internal documentation. This is not impossible, but it requires assumptions about effort and access that seem inconsistent with an elaborate internet prank. One theory is that Titor was himself connected to IBM, either as an employee or as someone who had worked with vintage computing systems. Perhaps he stumbled upon this information through professional channels and decided to build a story around it. But if that were the case, why choose such an obscure detail? Why not pick something more dramatic, something that could be verified immediately and publicly? The IBM 5100 feature was not confirmed until years after Titor disappeared, when former engineers happened to mention it in interviews. It was not the kind of detail that would generate immediate attention. Another possibility is that Titor made a lucky guess. Perhaps he knew the IBM 5100 was used in legacy systems and speculated that it might have undocumented features. This is theoretically possible, but it requires an implausible level of coincidence. The most straightforward explanation is that Titor knew about the feature because he had access to information from IBM insiders. But even this raises questions. If he had such access, what was his motive? There was no book deal, no movie rights, no monetization of the story. He posted on obscure forums, engaged for 5 months, and disappeared. The IBM 5100 claim remains the strongest single piece of evidence in favour of Titor's authenticity. It is a verifiable fact that was stated before public confirmation. It is a detail that should not have been casually known. And yet, it was. Chapter 5. Vanishing Without Resolution. On March 24th, 2001, John Titor posted what would become his final message on the Time Travel Institute forum. The post was brief, professional and unremarkable. He thanked the community for their time and questions. He stated that he would be leaving. He did not specify where he was going or whether he intended to return. And then he was gone. No dramatic exit, no final revelation, no attempt to provide proof that would settle the debate once and for all. He simply stopped posting. The account went silent. The conversation continued without him. In the years that followed, researchers attempted to trace his identity. Investigators analysed his IP addresses, though the logs from that era are incomplete. Some claim the posts originated from Florida. Others suggested connections to Texas or California. No definitive location was ever confirmed. Linguistic analysis was conducted on his writing. Researchers looked for patterns, idiosyncrasies, anything that might match other known internet personas. Some believed they found similarities to entertainment lawyers or aspiring science fiction writers. Others argued the analysis was inconclusive. No one came forward to claim credit. This is unusual. Internet hoaxes typically unravel. Someone talks, someone wants recognition, someone cannot resist explaining how they fooled everyone. But with Titor, the silence persisted. In 2003, a woman claiming to be Titor's mother appeared briefly online. She posted under the name K. Titor and stated that her son had returned to his own time. She provided no proof. She engaged minimally with questions. After a short time, she also disappeared. The posts added little to the mystery. If genuine, they only confirmed what Titor had already said. If part of the hoax, they demonstrated remarkable restraint. Most hoaxers would have used such an opportunity to expand the story, to add new details or dramatic twists. Kay Titor did not. She simply stated that her son had left and that she missed him. Attempts to monetize the story came later, but not from Titor himself. In 2003, a book titled John Titor, A Time Traveller's Tale was published. It compiled his forum, posts along with commentary and analysis. The book was released by the John Titor Foundation, an entity with unclear origins. Some speculated that the foundation was created by the original hoaxer, now seeking to profit from the attention. Others believed it was an independent project by people fascinated by the story. The foundation has never revealed who controls it, or whether they have any connection to the original posts. Entertainment lawyer Larry Haber became associated with the foundation. He has represented the interests of the John Titor story in media negotiations, and has been involved in discussions about potential film or television adaptations. Haber has never confirmed or denied whether he knows Titor's true identity. The involvement of a lawyer added fuel to skepticism. It suggested commercial motive, but it also raised questions. If the goal was profit, why wait years to monetize? Why not capitalize on the attention while it was at its peak? The delayed commercialization seemed inconsistent with a planned marketing campaign. Over the years, various individuals have been proposed as the real John Titor. Some have been investigated extensively. None have been definitively proven. The most compelling candidates have all denied involvement, and no evidence has emerged that conclusively links any individual to the posts. The mystery has persisted precisely because it has no clean resolution. There is no confession, no smoking gun, no moment where the curtain is pulled back and the truth is revealed. The case simply remains open, suspended in a state of permanent ambiguity. This lack of closure is itself unusual. It suggests either extraordinary discipline on the part of a hoaxer, or the possibility that there is nothing to confess. Chapter 6. Parallel Timelines and Damage Control. One of the most sophisticated aspects of John Titor's narrative was his explanation of how time travel functioned. He did not describe a single fixed timeline where changes could create paradoxes. he described something far more complex and, intriguingly, more consistent with certain interpretations of modern physics. According to Titor, time travel did not occur along a single linear path. Instead, the universe consisted of infinite parallel world lines, each representing a slightly different version of reality. Every quantum event, every decision, every moment of chance created branching points where timelines diverged. When a time traveller moved backward or forward in time, they did not stay within their original world line. They shifted to a parallel one. The degree of divergence depended on the distance travelled. A short jump of a few years might result in a world line almost identical to the origin. A jump of decades would result in greater differences. Titor used a percentage system to describe divergence. He claimed his world line had approximately a 2% divergence from the year 2000 timeline he was visiting. This meant that major historical events were the same. World War II occurred. The Cold War happened. Technology developed along similar paths. But minor details differed. This framework had profound implications. It meant that paradoxes were impossible. If you travelled back in time and killed your grandfather, you would not cease to exist. You would simply be in a world line where you were never born. Your original world line would continue unchanged, still containing the version of you who travelled back. The model also explained why Titor's predictions could fail without disproving his story. If his world line diverged from ours, events that occurred in his timeline might not occur in ours. The civil war he described might happen in his world line but not in ours. CERN might discover micro-black holes in his world line but not in ours. This creates an unfalsifiable narrative. Any failed prediction can be attributed to timeline divergence rather than fraud. Critics argue this makes the story immune to disproof. Supporters argue it makes the story consistent with real theoretical physics. The many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, on which Titor's model was based, is a legitimate scientific framework. It was developed by Hugh Everett III in his doctoral thesis at Princeton in 1957. Everett proposed that the wave function never collapses. Instead, all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement occur, each in a separate branch of reality. This interpretation has been debated extensively. Some physicists embrace it because it avoids the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Others reject it because it seems to violate Occam's razor by proposing an infinite number of unobservable universes. But the interpretation remains a valid solution to the equations of quantum mechanics. It is taught in university physics courses. It is discussed in peer-reviewed journals. It is not fringe science. Titor applied this framework to macroscopic time, travel. He suggested that the same branching that occurs at the quantum level occurs when traversing time. Each journey creates or accesses a new branch. This would have practical implications for time travellers. They could not use time travel to fix problems in their own timeline. They could gather information, retrieve objects, or observe historical events, but any intervention would only affect the new timeline they entered. Titor claimed that this was well understood in his era. Time travel was used for specific missions, primarily retrieval operations or reconnaissance. It was not used to prevent disasters because such prevention would only benefit alternate timelines, not the origin timeline. This pragmatic approach to time travel felt authentic. It lacked the grandiosity of most science fiction. It was not about saving the world or becoming a hero. It was about logistics, about obtaining specific resources or information under controlled conditions. The framework also provided a built-in explanation for why Titor could discuss future events without fear of changing them. Anything he said would only influence the timeline he was visiting, not his own. His timeline would continue on its path regardless of what he revealed. This created a strange ethical situation. Titor could warn people about future disasters, but those warnings would not save anyone in his timeline. They might save people in the new timeline, but his own loved ones, his own history, would remain unchanged. He acknowledged this in his posts. When asked why he did not try to prevent tragedies, he explained that it would be futile. He could prevent them here, but not there. And his mission parameters did not include intervention. This fatalistic acceptance felt real. It suggested someone who had thought deeply about the implications of time travel and had come to terms with its limitations. Chapter 7. Other cases that do not fit. John Titor is not the only person in history to claim foreknowledge of events or to exhibit information that seems temporally displaced. The historical record contains numerous accounts of individuals who described future technologies, predicted events, or possessed knowledge they should not have had. In 1932, a science fiction story called A Logic Named Joe was written by Murray Leinster. The story described a device that could access all human knowledge instantly, answer questions, and connect people across distances. It predicted the internet with remarkable accuracy, decades before computers were widely available. Was Leinster a time traveller? Almost certainly not. He was a skilled science fiction writer who extrapolated from existing trends. But the accuracy of his prediction demonstrates that foresight is possible without time travel. The question is always where the line exists between extrapolation and impossible knowledge. In 1950, a man named Rudolph Fentz allegedly appeared in New York City's Times Square and was struck by a car. According to the story, he was wearing 19th century clothing, carried old currency, and had no modern identification. Police investigated and supposedly found records of a man by that name who had disappeared in 1876. This story is compelling, but it was later revealed to be fiction. It originated in a short story published in Collier's magazine. The author Jack Finney wrote it as speculative fiction, not as a factual account. Over time, the story was repeated as if it were real, demonstrating how legends can emerge from creative work. The Fentz case is a cautionary tale. It shows how easily fiction can be mistaken for fact, especially when details are specific and the story has emotional resonance. It also shows why the Titor case is different. Titor's posts were not presented as fiction. They were presented as first-hand accounts, and they contained verifiable details that were later confirmed. In the 1980s and 90s, several individuals claimed to have knowledge of future events. Some described technological developments. Others predicted political changes or natural disasters. Most were wrong. A few were disturbingly accurate. In 1984, a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey predicted a series of global crises based on biblical prophecy. Many of the predictions failed, but some, particularly those related to Middle Eastern conflict and nuclear proliferation, aligned with later events. Was this foreknowledge or pattern recognition? The debate continues. In the early 2000s, anonymous posts began appearing on internet image boards, claiming knowledge of future events. Some predicted natural disasters, others described economic collapses or political upheavals. Most were quickly forgotten. A few remain unsettling. In 2008, a post on a forum claimed that a major earthquake would strike Japan. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami devastated the region. The post did not specify a date. It did not provide precise details, but it mentioned Japan, earthquakes, and nuclear consequences. The Fukushima nuclear disaster followed the earthquake. Skeptics note that Japan is an earthquake-prone region. Predicting an earthquake there is not remarkable, but the timing and the mention of nuclear consequences add a layer of specificity that is harder to dismiss as coincidence. In 2013, an anonymous user on an image board described a pandemic emerging from China that would spread globally and lead to widespread lockdowns. In 2019, such a pandemic began. The post did not name a virus. It did not give a timeline. But the general framework matched. Again, pandemics are not unprecedented. Predicting one is not impossible. But the specific mention of China, the description of global response, and the timing raise questions. These cases do not prove time travel. They are anomalies in a sea of failed predictions. But they share a pattern with the Titor case. They involve information appearing before it logically should. They lack drama. They are not accompanied by grand claims. They simply state something, and later something similar occurs. If time travel were real and operated according to Titor's model, this is what the evidence would look like. Not definitive proof, not public demonstrations, just information, slightly misplaced occasionally accurate, always deniable. Chapter 8. Government silence and plausible deniability. If time travel were possible, the question of why governments have not confirmed it becomes central. The answer may lie in the nature of the technology itself and the implications it would have for global stability. Time travel, if real, would represent the most significant strategic advantage in human history. It would dwarf nuclear weapons, surveillance systems, or any conventional military technology. A nation with time travel could observe enemy planning before it occurs, retrieve lost intelligence from historical archives, verify the accuracy of historical records, monitor the activities of rival nations in real time without detection, recover lost technologies or knowledge, understand the long-term consequences of policy decisions before implementing them. But these capabilities come with extraordinary risks. The potential for paradoxes, even in a many-worlds framework, could destabilize the fabric of reality. The economic implications would be catastrophic. If time travel were known to exist, markets would collapse. How could contracts be enforced if the past is not fixed? How could property rights be maintained? How could justice systems function? For these reasons, any government possessing time travel would maintain absolute secrecy. Disclosure would not be an option. Even limited acknowledgement would invite scrutiny, espionage, and destabilization. The technology would be compartmentalized, classified at the highest levels, and restricted to a small number of authorized personnel. This creates a problem for verification. If time travel is classified, there will be no public demonstrations, no congressional hearings, no freedom of information requests that yield results. The only evidence would be leaks, accidents, or individuals who travelled and chose to speak. John Titor fits this profile. He claimed to be a soldier on a sanctioned mission. He was not a rogue traveller or a whistleblower. He was operating, he said, within established protocols. His mission had specific parameters. He was retrieving a computer, visiting family, and observing the past. If the story were true, this is exactly how a controlled disclosure might occur. Not through official channels, which would be too risky, but through an individual who shared information in a format that was deniable. Internet forums in 2000 were perfect for this. They were obscure, loosely moderated, and easily dismissed as fiction. Titor's posts could be acknowledged without confirmation. Officials could dismiss them as creative writing. No investigation would be required. No resources would be allocated. The information would remain in the public domain, accessible to anyone curious enough to look but never validated. This approach provides plausible deniability. If questions arise, the answer is simple. It was a hoax, an elaborate internet story, entertainment, nothing more. But what if it was not? The strategic value of plausible deniability is immense. Information can be shared without risk. If the information proves useful to certain parties, it can be acted upon. If it proves inconvenient, it can be ignored. The source can be discredited without effort because the source has already discredited itself by claiming to be a time traveller. This is the perfect cover for a leak. It is information hiding in plain sight, protected by its own implausibility. Consider the alternative. If time travel exists and is classified, how else would information escape? Through official channels? Unlikely. Governments do not voluntarily disclose their most sensitive technologies. Through whistleblowers? Possible, but risky. Whistleblowers face prosecution, surveillance, and retaliation. An anonymous post on an obscure forum claiming to be from a time traveller would be dismissed immediately by most people. But it would also be preserved, archived, and accessible. It would enter the public consciousness without triggering a response from authorities. It would be the perfect method for getting information out without getting caught. Silence in this context is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of control. Governments that possess advanced technology do not announce it. They use it quietly, deny its existence publicly, and allow speculation to fill the void. The lack of official response to the Titor case is consistent with this model. No agency has investigated, no official has commented. The story remains in the realm of internet folklore, never quite debunked, never quite confirmed, and perhaps that is exactly the point. Chapter 9. The evidence that cannot be unseen. When all elements of the John Titor case are examined together, a pattern emerges that resists simple explanation. The individual components can be questioned, but the totality presents a more complex picture. The IBM 51